Welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. We have a fabulous guest on today. Once an English teacher, Griff Hosker is now a rather prolific historical fiction writer, having published over 180 books. And here was I thinking 8 was a good number. In the last 12 years, Griff has written in many periods, from Roman books through Saxons, Vikings, Normans, Stephen and Matilda, the Crusades, King John, Richard II, Edward I, Tudor England, the conquest of the Americas, and the conquistadors. So when Eric and I decided we wanted to revisit the Norman Conquest with a different angle, who better to join us than Griff Hosker? Welcome, Griff.
Thank you very much.
So 2 of your latest books, Hastings and Conquest, are set during and in the aftermath of the Norman Conquest. What attracts you to the 11th century?
I think it was a crucible. It's the point where we ceased to be Saxon and we became Norman. And it was, for me, it was just a tumultuous time when you think of the battles that were fought and the way that the people changed. I mean, Duke William, when he came over with the avowed intent of conquering a country, and he managed it. And then if you look at the other Normans who went to Italy and did the same, they were just a phenomenal people. So for me, it was this melting pot. And I tend to write my stories and try and link them all. So there's a link in my stories from the Romans right through to my Border Night series, and you can see a thread going all the way through, looking at the people at the time. And my second series I wrote was set around the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which came before Hastings. So I'd already written about the Battle of Hastings from the Saxon point of view, but I didn't do it with anyone at the battle, basically because, if you like, all the good guys got killed. So that's what fascinated me about the period of the 11th century. And I have written quite a lot about it. I mean, on Sunday, I took my wife out for a meal and we were up at a place called Bishopton, which is just 8 miles up the road. It's where the Bishop of Durham, when he came over, built his first castle. And you can still see it. And it's literally just a mound, a motte and bailey there. And I've always been fascinated with that. When you look at these really small castles that the Normans built, and yet they managed to control the whole country. It was unbelievable what they managed to do with such a small number of people, because it wasn't like an invasion where thousands of people came over. It was a small elite of men who came over. So to answer your question, the 11th century for me was a crucible. It was a time of creation, and it created a world which we still live in nowadays. I live in Stockton, which is from the Danish stockaded settlements, and yet just across the river is a place called Billingham, which was Saxon. And then all the other places around here, Chester Le Street, Bishop Auckland, were all Norman. So you can actually see in the place names around here how England changed. And we did what we do very well. We picked all the best bits and we made a country, or we made a people, which then led on to unbelievable things in the later times. So yes, fascinating time.
And you and Derek, of course, were both history teachers, so 1066 is the one year that every kid should and is able to remember, usually.
It's the one answer that they always know on Pointless. They might know nothing else, but they'll know 1066.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned mottes, because when you think about it, I mean, most of us are not very far from a mott, are we? I mean, there's loads of the things all over the place. A lot of them unnoticed, I suppose. There are still many, I think, that probably most people, even locally, aren't aware of. it's just a mound, really,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's just a raised area.
Yeah, or there's a street named Castle Street nearby or something.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Now you've hinted that you didn't write it from the Saxon point of view because nobody important or interesting survived from the Saxon point of
Yeah.
view. Tell us a bit about your protagonist, the Norman. Well, it's a family, I guess, the Fitzmallets, but Robert Fitzmallet is one of your protagonists, isn't he?
What I did was I found a real one of William the Conqueror's close friends, William Mallet. And William Mallet was in York. He was given York and he fought at the Battle of Hastings, and he was reputedly the one who rescued Harold's body after it had been was being desecrated by a knight. So I like to find actual facts, but then weave the story. So I created an illegitimate brother from the father who was the son of a housecarl. So I could have my protagonist as half Saxon, half Norman, but fighting on the Norman side. So I could then create a character who had all this angst about, these are my grandfather's people that I'm killing here, and so he wasn't just a cold-blooded butcher. So I wanted to do him like that, but I also wanted to have him as a hero. I mean, I do like writing about heroes. So I had him being trained by Talifer, and Talifer was someone I vaguely knew about before I started the research. And then when I did do it, I found why we don't know more about Talifer. He was a knight, but he was a knight without a squire. He was a juggler and a jongleur. And apparently he was a really good friend of William the Conqueror. And I put it in in the book Hastings. He actually asked William the Conqueror, could he start the battle? Do you mind if I go and start the battle? So when they all lined up, Talifer rides up on his horse called Parsifal, goes in front of the housecarls and starts juggling swords and singing the Song of Roland, which again I put in my book. There's only one source for this, but I thought it's too good not to.
Yeah.
But still, the housecarl just sat there listening to it and going, oh, it's a nice song, this, we enjoy this, and they wouldn't start a battle. So he takes his sword, rides up and smashes a housecarl across the head, at which point the rest of them rose up, grabbed him off the horse and hacked him to bits, and the battle started. And I thought, this is priceless stuff, isn't it? This is absolutely, maniac who decides it for honour is going to get himself killed and start the Battle of Hastings. I've never known anything like that. So I wanted him to be the one who trained my hero so that I can keep referring to him later on in the later books and so on. So he's a complex character. He's not as simple as some of my characters, because again, he has mixed blood and he's got mixed experiences, and he likes a lot that the Normans do and he hates a lot that the Normans do. So Fitzmallet, my hero, is not real. His brother is real. And again, when I did Conquest, I was able to put in the true story about how York was taken and William Mallet was taken prisoner by the Saxons.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that you kind of are going counterculture in that certainly when I grew up, the Normans were the baddies.
Yeah.
And the Saxons were the goodies. And everything you saw, films, television, books you read, it reflected that basic idea that the Normans, they did bad things, they didn't behave very well, and so on. They were cruel, and you're turning that on its head to an extent, aren't you?
Yeah, well, you and I grew up watching Alan Wheatley as a sheriff of Nottingham and Lawrence Green as Robin Hood, where they were, and again, they kind of perpetrated that in the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, didn't they? Where they are absolute baddies. However, the records are that Harold Godwinson did not have a great claim to the throne of England. He had married the sister of, the Edward, who was a holy king. But apparently, and again, this is the problem with all these ancient records. The only evidence we've got for William's claim to the throne came from the Normans after the event, who said that Edward the Confessor went to France and said that you will be my heir. And then we've also got the other Norman story about, and it's a true one, about how Harold was shipwrecked, and when he was rescued by the Normans, swore that he would support William when he wanted to be king. So that's the evidence. What we do have evidence of is that Harold fought alongside William and helped him fight the Bretons, and he showed himself to be a great fighter and impressed William. So they parted as friends, and then Edward died, and Harold said quite rightly, "No, you know what? I think I'm going to be king." So yes, they are portrayed as the baddies. I don't think they are as bad as they make out. So, for example, the harrying of the North, which I know you want me to talk about later on, but the harrying of the North came about. King William tried his best to incorporate the English nobility, so the Earls of Mercia were left their land. He didn't take it off them. He left them as earls, and he was quite happy. He left the Earl of Northumberland with his land, and they were all Saxons, Saxon days. He left them, and it was only when they then reneged on the agreement they had with him that he began his slaughter. But again, the slaughter occurred because Robert Comines went north on the orders of King William to Durham. They'd got York and they wanted Durham, where the bones of St Cuthbert were, and that was considered a holy place. However, Robert Comines and his 500 men arrived on January the 28th and proceeded to get drunk and abuse the Saxon women, at which point the men of Durham, who are, I've forgotten the name now, but they've got a specific name, they are somewhat unique. And they decided to butcher Robert Comines. So that was why he harried the North. And when he harried the North, he actually didn't kill as many as people think. What he did do, he caused the deaths of 100,000 people because he killed every animal and took every animal away, and the people simply starved to death. It was a lesson, a fairly savage lesson, but there again, it's supposed like Genghis Khan did the same kind of thing, didn't it? You killed all the men and took all the women, and that's how, it goes back to Roman times, the rape of the Sabine women and so on. So yes, it was cruel, it was harsh. I don't think it was particularly justified, but if you're the winners, you can get away with that kind of thing, and he did, and it made the North a wasteland, an absolute wasteland. At this time, butchery of your enemies was fairly acceptable, and the ordinary people, they were the ones who suffered. They were the ones who had no one to protect them.
Yeah.
So it was a hard time, really hard time.
I think people also forget that at 1066, it was a moment of upheaval for England. But England had been going through upheaval for the last 50 years, 50, 60 years, since Sweyn Forkbeard took over the throne in 1014. And then Canute and Edmund Ironside, and the throne had been going between the English and the Danish for 50 years. They were quite used to the change.
I mean, Ethelred the Unready never was a more aptly described king. He was the most incompetent king we've ever had, and badly advised, and and all these characters who were around him. So you're right, England was in an absolute mess. I mean, I think Harold Godwinson was a fairly good leader. I mean, he was a strong leader, but I'm not certain he would have made a great king. He lost the Battle of Hastings because of the Vikings.
Yes.
Because Tostig and Harold Hardrada came over to York, and Harold made the mistake, I think it was a mistake, of travelling all the way north with his army, which they did brilliantly. I mean, that was a superb military move, defeated them, and then came all the way back to fight a battle against the Normans. And it was just a battle too far.
Do you not think, though, if he hadn't gone north, that the way things panned out initially at Fulford, where Edwin and Morcar were defeated by Hardrada, it wasn't looking good for the north. So would he not have lost control of the north, do you think, if he stayed to fight William?
He might have done, but the kings of Wessex always had a powerless hold on the north. I mean, it was Northumbria was and is unique. It's a really strange place. I mean, I love living so close to it, but when you go there, have you been up to Bamber and seen that magnificent castle up there?
Yeah.
So I'm not certain if you like, he would have lost it. But I think William showed he knew how to get it back, just by going up there, building his castles, have his castles, send his men's out on a chevauchee and just literally take what he wanted. So, yes, I think he would have lost it if he'd not gone up, if he hadn't gone up to fight them. But yeah, the Battle of Stamford Bridge was a pivotal battle.
But I guess the Danish hold on the north was already very strong. It was there in the psyche of the people who lived there. And for those in Wessex in the south, it was still a sort of foreign land in a way, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we call it York because of Jorvik. It came from that name. Until then, when the Romans were, it was Iberacum. It totally changed. So they made the north. It was totally Danish. I mean, I love looking at old maps, and I use a lot of old maps in my research because I've bought all the Ordnance Survey maps that were first made. And if you look at 1860, although they've got railway lines, it looks very different. It looks more like it would have done in the times of in medieval times. And Lincoln was a port in Roman times.
Yeah.
All that land, around the Wash hadn't been reclaimed, so the Vikings were able to sail all the way around there, and Canute and Svein, that's where they did. They had their base at Gainsborough. That was where they had their base.
Yeah,
that was an important place. So yeah, they made the whole of the northeast their own. I mean, it was the northwest where there was nothing, just about. No one bothered about that part of the world. That's where I come from originally.
Well, it's like they call Wessex the last kingdom because it was the last one. It was the only one that didn't fall to the Danes. But Northumbria is also the last kingdom because it's the last one that was brought into the Kingdom of England.
I mean, that's why William tried to put his own man in there. He put Gospatrick in there, who immediately rebelled against him. And it was after that he thought, well, I've tried my best, lads. I've tried to put a Dane in charge or a Saxon in charge. I'm going to put one of my own men, and that's what he did. And he put his own men all over the country. So the whole thing about the Robin Hood legend about Saxon nobles and Norman nobles, I think that's one of the big problems we have in this country. We all grew up, as Derek said, believing that, and I'm not certain it was that true. The Saxon nobility was very treacherous. I mean, look at the way Edmund died.
Yeah.
Fairly gruesome.
Yeah. And Edric Striona, who was always out for whoever would give him greatest advantage.
I think one of the things that in modern times, and you've hinted at it by talking about the old maps, and I do the same as you. I look at even the Victorian ones, the early Victorian ones, the amount of change that happens over the centuries before that is very minimal compared to the amount of change that happens after that time. So you get more of an idea. But over the centuries, there have been umpteen rebellions in places that are far away from the south and London. And the reason is quite simple, that they are far away. And if you're put in charge of those areas, you regard them as your sort of fiefdom, really, whoever put you there. And it's, history repeats itself all the time. There are rebellions in the north a great deal.
Look at Edward I, Longshanks, who I've written a few books about. He knew how to handle these places. He put a ring of castles everywhere, put his knights there. I mean, once he got to Wales, that was it. The Welsh, they had another rebellion with Owen Glyndŵr, against Henry. But apart from that, once Edward had put his castles there, they were just almost sterilized. They couldn't do much.
And that's, I guess, the policy that William the Conqueror brought in, wasn't it? As you said earlier, just you plonk a castle down, usually on top of somebody's house, and then you just rule from there.
I mean, even Hereward the Wake, who was again another freedom fighter stroke rebel, he was bought off. He doesn't die in battle. William knew how to buy people off, and he gave him land. He was very good at doing that.
Mm.
If you and again, as long as you didn't betray him, but if you betrayed him, woe betide you.
Well, that was it, wasn't it? Voltioff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
Voltioff? I don't know how to pronounce it.
I do have narrators for my audiobooks, and they're forever ringing me saying, "How do you pronounce this?" I just know how to write it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can spell it, I can write it, I have no idea how to say it.
There's nothing similar, so it's like I just
No.
do it, phonetically, Voltioff, but I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm saying it right or not.
Yeah.
It might be Valsoff or something. But he was executed by William.
Yeah.
Even though he was married to William's niece.
Yeah, you didn't mess with William.
Do you think that's why basically he succeeded not only at Hastings but afterwards? Is that he was just as you say, you couldn't mess with him. He was quite definite about how he was going to rule.
Yes, because he not only conquered England, he went back to Normandy and made Normandy and Maine so secure that the French feared him. I mean, he was always their vassal still, but that was a historic thing. And that's why, Henry V was supposed to be the vassal. But he was a strong king, and he went back, conquered that. He managed to make Britain his allies, and he made Anjou his allies. So he was so powerful that even those neighbours were afraid to actually take him on. And if you look at, his kind of dynasty through Henry I and then Henry II, the dynasty he created was very powerful. It wasn't until you come to, Henry V's son that you start to see the crumbling of the English kings. Until then, there were aberrations like obviously Richard II and the famous King John. But if you take those aberrations out, most of the kings we had after William were fairly strong and knew what they were doing.
Do you think Harold had any chance of winning at Hastings? It comes across as a close run thing, doesn't it? I mean, they were fighting all day.
Yes, they would have won, but for the third, the ordinary soldiers. His housecarls, he didn't have as many as he would have done if he hadn't fought at Stamford Bridge. But at one point in the battle, the Normans fell back, basically because they wanted to regroup. The third thought that they were retreating, and they charged after them, and then they were cut down by horsemen. They managed to get back in position, but William realised very quickly, these people are going to come chasing after me, so they feigned a retreat, and it was a Norman tactic that they used a lot, and that's what they did. They were able to do it because they were horsemen. They could ride up, throw spears, arrows, whatever, darts, and then when they ran away, the ordinary chaps, the ones who just had a club, spear, they would run after them. And once they were killed, then it was quite simple. They just brought up the Norman archers, sent arrows high into the sky, attacked them from the ground. So if the ordinary Saxon soldiers hadn't disobeyed their orders, they would have won, because the Normans they were charging up a hill on horses that were tired, and it was a near run thing. At one point, William had to lift his visor up to show he wasn't dead, because his men were getting a bit panicky about the fact, and all they had was this temporary castle they got from IKEA, which they brought over and put up at Pevensey. And that's all they had. So that if the Saxons had won, they would have had to go all the way back to Normandy. So yeah, it was very, very close. It was a lot closer than I think history remembers. It's like Waterloo.
Yeah,
Wellington almost lost Waterloo. If Marshal Ney hadn't thrown away all the French cavalry, then who knows what would have happened. It's one of those things that wargamers and reenactors are constantly debating. But it's the same is true about Hastings. If you get Saxon and Norman reenactors, they will all argue that either side could have won on the day. As it happened, William won.
And I guess the Normans, because they had nowhere really to fall back to, there was an element of desperation. It was a desperation which could cause them to lose, but also it was a desperation that would make them try to ensure that they didn't, because everything was on the line for them. If the English lost, they could retreat and fight again.
Yeah, the other thing about that is that because the ones fighting with Harold were the housecarls, they'd taken a blood oath. They were these bodyguards, so that they weren't going to retreat, and they were virtually slaughtered to a man. So the very nucleus of the rebellion that might have followed were killed, and all the ones who survived were the people like the Earls of Mercia, who, tacitly stayed away. Oh, we'll come, we'll send our troops a little bit later, because they were waiting to see who won. They were being classically Saxon and seeing which side came out victorious, and then they immediately went to William. I think it was some about January of 1067, and swore allegiance to him at Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
He could have been crowned king in October, but he deliberately waited until, I think it was January, February.
Christmas Day.
Yeah, Christmas Day, that's right, yeah. And when he got them down there, because he wanted them to acknowledge him as king. They did, and then went back on the word.
Yeah. But I guess you could say another reason Harold lost is that he didn't wait in London. He could have waited for more of his men to come, so that he had an overwhelming force.
Yeah, and London was defensible.
Yeah.
And it was defensible against horsemen classically.
Mm.
He would have easily held out, but no, he wanted to send them back. He didn't want them ravaging his land, because and again, Duke William landed very cleverly in Wessex, where he wanted to hit at the heartland of Earl Godwin, and he did it very successfully.
Yeah, so unlucky for Harold.
I think William had an awful lot of luck on his side, and
oh, he did.
It's just like he could have gone either way, but I think his confidence helped him an awful lot.
I think any if you read about the great generals, all of them believe in luck. Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon, Wellington, they all never underestimated the value of luck in a battle. And that one crucial moment. I've just been writing about Sir John Hawkwood, and at the Battle of Castagno, he was 70 years old, just about 70. He was outnumbered 2-1 by the Milanese and Veronese, and he saw this little chance. He was in the battle and he saw that the enemy had committed itself in his centre, so he just went round the side, won his greatest victory, and defeated the Milanese for the first time. And it was literally that one moment of pure luck when he managed to see something that no one else had. So I think any general would take that. You took the luck when you had it,
but also you make the most of it. It's one thing to notice that there's an advantage to be gained, but as you say, the best generals are the ones who could take advantage of it.
Yeah, the whole thing about the invasion came about because his fleet was blocked in the harbour. They'd eaten so much food that his horses were about to starve, and they saw this Halley's Comet.
Yeah.
And he immediately said, there you go, let's sail across. And they sailed across. And that was no mean undertaking. I mean, the next time that happened successfully was June 6th, 1944.
Yeah.
I mean, they were transporting their horses, and it was a big undertaking for the time.
Yeah, no one had ever done that before. I mean, when the Vikings and Danes raided, they didn't take horses. What they did, they used horses. Famously, the Danes, when they had the Great Heathen Army, stole hundreds of horses and then were able to, pillage the land. They didn't fight on horseback, but they rode all over.
I guess the Romans must have.
Yeah, the Romans did, except that when they came on their 2 invasions, they didn't actually bring horsemen for the invasion. They brought them over later on.
Yeah.
I love the Agricola story. Do you know the Agricola story about Anglesey? When Julius Agricola came to the Menai Straits, and the Welsh were all on Anglesey, bearing their buttocks and doing what they did. At which point, Julius Agricola told his auxiliary horsemen, take off their armour and swim the horses across the Menai Straits, at which point the Welsh just ran. They just swam across. I love that story.
I seem to remember most history books about the Normans and the Saxons have Normans fighting on horseback and say how much that is of an advantage against the Saxons, who would ride to battle but then dismount to actually fight.
Yeah. Except the horses weren't that big. If you see the pictures from the Bayeux Tapestry, which are fairly accurate, the horseman's feet are almost touching the ground. But the advantage you have got is if you've got a long kite shield, your left side is completely covered, and on your right side you've got a long spear or lance, which will keep the enemy at bay. And bearing in mind that your lance or spear is going to be longer than any Saxon spear in a shield wall, and you are stabbing down, you've got a big advantage. And of course, the Normans all wore mail hauberks, which went all the way down to their knees, and then they had boots underneath, so they were better protected. And the Saxons, their most fearsome weapon was a Danish two-handed axe. So they had a shield wall, but if you're using a two-handed axe, you can't defend yourself using your shield.
No.
You could have it hanging, and they did. They had a strap called a guide or guide strap, which kept it loosely over your shoulder, but you'd be swinging an axe in a figure of 8, making it very hard for anyone to get near you. But if you were stabbing down at them, and again, that's why the Saxons were unlucky not to win, because they were at the top of a hill. I've been to Battle Abbey and seen where they were fighting. That the horsemen would have been almost on a level with the Saxons until they came charging down. And a man on foot, not protected by shields, is very vulnerable.
Yes. So in terms of your research, and over the years, you've written so many books, you must have done a heck of a lot of research. What's your method? How do you go about it?
I use the Osprey books, the Men-at-Arms books, as my starting point, because most of mine have a military sort of theme. So I like to know, and again, you said it before, Sharon, I like to know what they wore, how they dressed, how they ate. So I like to research that side of it first. Then I go to, I've got a book, a friend of mine bought it in a second-hand bookshop for 40p. It's called The Kings and Queens of England.
I've got one of those.
Britain. And it goes back to, it's got, all this is, it's pure factual, goes back to just after the Romans, right the way through. And I find that great. You can find all the people you need to. And then I start my research. Now, I've got lots of books. I just bought a new one yesterday about Margaret Beaufort, because I'm planning on doing something about her. But I buy lots of books. I'm in my study now, surrounded by books. And so I go to my source material. The book I'm writing at the moment about Vikings, I went down to the British museum exhibition about the Vikings the other year, and I bought the book there. And I just go to all those books with the facts and the pictures. I then use it, if I can, I go to the places I'm writing about. So I'm not lazy, but I write more about the north of England, because that's where I live. I live just 50 miles from Alnwick and Bamborough, and Hadrian's Wall is 35 miles away, so I tend to go to the places I write about. I go to every reenactment I can do, and every reenactment event. So I know reenactors, I speak to them. When I did about Zulu, I not only had the uniform, but I was able to go and find someone who had a Zulu shield, the Martini Henry rifle, which I've used. It didn't fire because it was a non-firing one. When I was in America, a friend of mine, when I was doing the World War II stuff, he had a machine gun. I was able to fire a machine gun. So when I wrote my books about commando, I fired his Colt, which the commandos had. I fired a crossbow. I've not been able to pull a longbow. However, Jeff Boxall, who lives in New Zealand, is a master archer, manages to correct everything I do if I say something wrong. And I know, so I think I write fairly accurately now. I didn't used to, about archery, because I've been put straight, and I'm quite happy to be put straight. The reenactors have let me fire a musket. So I know what it's like to fire a musket. I've fired a cannon. I fired a Roman ballista. So I like to get into all of that. And then I like to imagine where I am. But the actual events, I always start with a real event that's in my book. And then everything leads to that real event. And I try and fit it all in accurately. Now, sometimes, so for example, the latest book I've done about the Condottieri in Italy, I've found a book, but it was translated from the Italian. And the problem I always find with the translation is the idioms aren't quite right. You do get contradictions. So once I get a contradiction, I'll go to another source and try and remedy it. Sometimes I can't. So, put my hand up. I take my best guess. So, that's what you do.
Yeah.
Historical writing. You try and be accurate. But when it comes down to it, you're right. Ridley Scott is right. We weren't there. We don't know. We make it up from the records. They're written by the winners.
Don't tell him that.
The winners always record history, don't they? You know.
Actually, these days it's written by Hollywood, but
when I did Zulu, I couldn't believe how wrong Hollywood got the character of Henry Hook.
Yeah.
By James Booth. And his granddaughters, who were at the premiere in 1960, whatever, were so appalled at this treatment of him, they walked out because he had one drink in his life.
Yeah.
After the battle of
he was a completely different person from
yeah
from the one that's portrayed.
They couldn't have got it more wrong, is what I'm saying.
No.
You know, and they did. So yeah, you do your best, and I don't think I've made a Henry Hook mistake in any of my books.
It's always best to stay with the medieval, because that way there's nobody living who remembers them.
That's why I love writing about the Vikings. You know, there's very little records. All we've got are what these priests said about, you know, the Norsemen coming, and they were just petrified of the Norsemen, who basically just wanted the silver. Although, interestingly enough, I've just read a book which lays the causes of the Viking raids on the holy places down to Charlemagne. Oh. Now, I hadn't read this before, but Charlemagne, when he invaded Pomerania and Saxony, because he was carrying the papal banner, made a point of destroying all the holy places of the pagans. Yes. And then when he went to Denmark, he did the same. So there's one theory, and I hadn't read it before a couple of weeks ago, that Charlemagne caused it because the Vikings were just getting their own back, saying, you're destroying our holy places, we're going to destroy yours. Of course, when they went to the holy places, they suddenly found they're full of gold and silver, and Vikings like that. So it's kind of fill your boots, lads. We've got a double whammy here.
Yeah.
So you've written in a number of different periods, from Roman to Victorian. Yeah. What's your favourite period to write about?
Whichever I'm writing about at the time. That's the easy answer. I loved writing the World War II and World War I books, and the reason was I put my dad in them, and because he'd spoken to me about it, when I was writing about that period, I felt I was able to get more into what it was like for the people. So, for example, my dad was at Sword Beach in June 6, 1944, and he told me the story about how the Ullican gunner next to him on Landing Craft 523 had his head blown off as they were approaching the beach. And he always said to me, he said, Griff, you came within that much of never being born.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know? Yeah. And so there were stories like that my dad told me, and all the guys who he used to drink with were all ex-servicemen. I used to drink with him. And so I had all those stories. So that for me is probably the most comfortable period to write about. But I do like writing about the Viking period because it's so familiar to me. And it was also the series that I got my first success with. The Dragonheart series. So I do like that. And I must tell you this story. You both will have stories like this, I know. But when I was on holiday last year with my wife, I got an email from a reader. And the email said, Griff, I'm one of your greatest fans. I love your research, love your attention to detail, because I'm an ex-librarian. A few years ago, my husband had a wound to his foot, which necessitated the amputation of one of his toes. But COVID struck, and we live remotely, so I couldn't tend to him. However, I remembered reading in your Dragonheart books about how the Vikings tended wounds with honey, vinegar, and herbs. I made him poultices for his foot. I have to say that 3 years later, my husband has all his toes, so I'd like to thank you.
Oh, brilliant.
The point about that story is that you do your research, and it's so nice when you find that something you did research is not only true, but still valid today. And so the Viking period, I'm just returned to it for a brand new series I started 2 days ago. And it as I said, Derek, early on, it feels like wearing an old shoe. You're putting a very comfortable shoe on. You know it's going to fit, and it's worn. But so I suppose the Vikings is my favourite period of all time. However, Ben Kane is organising a walking tour in November.
He is, yeah.
And I'm going on it. So I have a feeling there will be a Roman series. And that was the very first series I wrote. And I quite enjoyed writing that, because of people like Simon Scarrow and all those authors that I'd read, and Gordon Doherty. And so I may go back to that, and I may find that becomes my favourite period. There are some which, we've all had our disasters, and there are periods I don't think I will return to, but they're few and far between.
The new Viking series, how is that different from what you've done before, or isn't it?
It will be different. I'm going back to basics. I want to write about how the Vikings first came to England, and so the idea is going to be I'm going to have showing the evolution of a Norse warrior, and I think I've got a better handle on that now than I did when I wrote Dragonheart, because I've met more reenactors, and so I know what a warrior would be like, but I'm intent to have him being left in England. Oh. I read when I did my work, my Viking book about going to the New World, I discovered the very first people who lived on Iceland were a Viking warrior and his wife, who were left behind by mistake. So they found Iceland, took what they could do, and then when they left, he and his wife were off doing something. So they were and it struck me, well, it could happen, you want to get back on a boat. You're not going to have someone doing it like you did as a school teacher, going, right, I'm going to count them all now. No one's going to be counting all the people back on the longship. And I just thought I could have him living in England, and therefore write about it from the viewpoint of it, from the northeast of England point of view, of the people who made the northeast Danish, and so they came as settlers, but also some must have come just as visitors and stayed. So it's going to be writing about that. It will be based around the northeast, and it will be looking at the places which are around here. It might not be as long as the 22-book Dragonheart series, but it's just something I wanted to write. I'm at the point now where I can write what I want to.
Yeah.
I don't have to write anything. I've got the books ready to be published right up to the end of June. So this book won't be due out until September. I've got lots of time to really get into this. I'm going back to Alnwick again in July, and I can look at, the kind of remnants up there, and go and look at Lindisfarne. Actually go there and see the Vikings. So it's nice that I can choose to write about that period, and it will be different. All my books are different. I try and make them, although the kind of lead characters all have a lot in common.
Yeah, I guess that happens, doesn't it, really, with all of us?
If I ever do create a character who is not in my norm, my wife always complains. She's my editor, by the way, and she was, oh, I didn't like him. Oh, I didn't like what he did. So she sees them as real characters, which is good. I mean, I'll take that. So when I have, like, Sir John Hawkwood was a bit of a nasty man.
Yeah.
And she's glad I've just finished that series, because she didn't particularly like Sir John Hawkwood. He was not a likable man. Well, he wasn't, but successful.
I think, like you say, though, living where you do have so much. Like I've noticed, I actually live 5 minutes from Gainsborough.
Nice.
And Conisbrough Castle's half an hour away. So around here, the reenactors do tend to be Saxon or Viking. Like one group I did a talk with a little while ago, Sud Jorvik. They always go up to the Jorvik festival because it's their period, pre-1066. And they're so invested in it, and they know so much about it. And they practice, Sud Jorvik actually practice at Conisbrough Castle once a month. First Saturday of the month, they go up to Conisbrough Castle and they actually practice their sword fighting in the atmosphere.
Fantastic. Well, I must tell you a reenactor story. The East India Company, they're reenactors, and they quite like me. So they invited me to go to an event at Whitby Abbey for all periods reenactors, but they wanted me with my camera because I do take photographs. And they wanted me to take the photographs of a Viking couple who were hand-fasted at Whitby Abbey. And they said, will you come, Griff, and take the photograph? So I went into Whitby, and they got through, I think it's about 150 litres of mead, because one of them is a mead maker. So I went up there, I took the photographs, and then they said, what we want to do is we want to go and have a photograph with the East India Company, give him an honour guard, shooting their muskets above this couple who've just got married. So the most bizarre experience, redcoats firing muskets over a pair of Vikings. And then because it was raining, we went into that church at the top of Whitby Abbey. It's a beautiful old church.
Yeah,
and they actually cleared it for us. And so they decided to pose some photographs with a 19th century English sea captain marrying this Viking couple, with an English redcoat giving them away. And I took the wedding photos. But everything else apart from that was perfectly, in period. They were all living the way it was. So yeah, reenactors are great people. Love them.
I just think whenever I see anything like that, though, I think 100 years down the line, when the explanation for the photo is no longer extant, that's going to really mess up a historian.
Yeah, I get loads of lovely emails from all my readers, and we all do, I know, and it's delightful. But one of them, Viking reenactor, he makes mead. So he named a mead he made after my character. And he'd asked me, he said, "Do you mind if I call this mead Dragonheart Mead?" Sent me some bottles as well. So it was kind of quite lovely.
That's fascinating. It's nice to have that connection though, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I have stayed with my readers. When I went to New Zealand, I stayed with my readers. The first thing I do at 6 o'clock when I start work is read all my emails and answer them. And I do have readers who live all over the world. You find out where later on, but they do come from the most strange countries, far afield. And I mean, for example, one of them, I met someone who said, "I met one of your readers in Panama. And he writes your Viking books. He says you're the best Viking." I said, "Oh, fine." Turns out this guy is a Viking. He's Norwegian. And as a result of him, I got a couple of bookshops in Norway and Sweden who wanted to stock my hardback and paperback books. So, kind of quite how that connection came about, So, but yes, I do have a lot of emails. I answer them every single day. And for good or ill, you do get you do get it. And that's fine. You take it.
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of social media. We know instantly whether or not our readers like what we're writing because they'll let us know. Whereas, 40 or 50 years ago, you were writing something you didn't know until it was out and had been doing the rounds for a while, whether or not it would be successful.
Yeah, that's right. And how did you know? You knew from a book reviewer, it's like every critic. I am very skeptical of a lot of critics, and this is it's not personal experience, but it's just what other people have said about I suppose that the best example is the Beatles. The Beatles went to Decca and they were told they didn't have a future. A critic there didn't like their material. Really, the Beatles not see. So and there are other people, and again, the authors who were rejected, and had to keep going and going and going. So for me, I quite like the social media angle.
Yeah. That's the thing, isn't it? Because in the old days, the critics were the newspapers, the magazines who'd get a copy and review it. Nowadays, the reviewers are the people who buy the book because they want to read that story.
Yeah. Oh, yes, it's true. I mean, you've got to live with the fact that, and everyone has suffered this, someone will write a really poor review because they want to. And that's fine. That's how you can. I look at my reviews and look at what they've said in their emails to me and just take the positive that the majority, really see positives in the story. But again, sometimes I've got some people who won't read my Hastings books because they don't like the Normans. Which is fine. I fully understand that. And then you get others who think you've portrayed someone in a particularly bad light, so that therefore they disapprove of that, and that's fine as well.
Clearly, they've got long memories of 1,000 years that they really don't like those Normans. They haven't forgiven them yet.
What did those Normans ever do for us?
Right.
Actually, there was a thing on Facebook, I think it was last week, there was some announcement about celebrating the birthday of William the Conqueror, and practically everybody on the thread was going, I won't be celebrating. Or words to that effect, and not as kind words to that effect.
I realized that when I wrote the Conquest, I'd pricked a nerve in a lot of people because and I did get, it wasn't hate mail at all, nothing like that, don't get me wrong. It was people saying, "Why are you doing this?" Why don't do this, don't.
Oh, well, Griff, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. and great insight into your research.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you,
it's
Derek.
great.
It's been lovely.
It's been very, very good to hear a bit about how you go about what you do as well.
I'm writing 5,000 words a day.
It's just habit now. I mean, my wife does say I'm a grumpy old man at the best of times, but if I don't write, I'm grumpy.
She can't see much of you, though,
No,
Griff.
you know.
I mean,
You're married 52 years. That's probably a bonus.
That's why she wants him to write 5,000 words a day.
Yeah. Yeah, the secret's out. You heard it here.
Come down for dinner and that's it.
Well, thank you for that. It's been really delightful. And anytime you want to chat, whatever, it doesn't have to be on, you know, on for this. It's been lovely talking to two fellow authors, because writing is a very lonely profession.
Yeah.
And the only time you ever get to meet people is like when I go to conferences, and I love going to conferences because you get to meet everyone and they can tell you all their stories and so on.
Anyway, it's been really great to talk to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Griff. Lovely chatting with you.
Thanks a lot, Derek. Thanks a lot, Sharon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Do join us next time when Derek and I will be looking into the anarchy for the first time since our very first episode, when we will be looking at the two Matildas, Matilda of Boulogne and Empress Matilda, and comparing and contrasting. Thanks for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. We hope you've enjoyed listening. If you have, perhaps you'd like to give us a review or a like, and by all means, subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss the next one. Thanks for listening.